Creeping re-militarization? This year marks the 80th anniversary of the Tokyo trials, which laid bare the terrible crimes of Japanese militarists and brought them to justice. Yet Japan's recent moves serve as powerful evidence that militarism still remains firmly on its agenda. A $7 billion warship deal with Australia, the largest ever military contingent sent to join U.S. war games in the Philippines, and the official easing of arms exports, among other dangerous moves. All these in rapid succession over just a matter of a few days. So what do all these reveal about Japan's agenda? Is there a revival of militarism? And if so, what are the potential consequences for the region and for the world that must be told to people who are watching this? Welcome to this very special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Central China's Henan province. I'm pleased to be joined from Beijing by three guests: Ben Norton, Editor-in-Chief of Geopolitical Economy Report; Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies; and Ina Tangen, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. First of all, let's take a closer look at the specific moves that have been taken in just over the past week. On April the 17th, Japan sent a self-defense force vessel into the Taiwan Strait in a deliberate provocation. The next day, on April the 18th, Australia and Japan signed contracts worth $7 billion, and the deal is to supply Canberra with warships. This is marking Japan's biggest military sale since the end of its military export ban in 2014. 2 days later, on April the 20th, Japan sends its largest ever contingent to join U.S. war games in the Philippines. Then the next day, on April the 21st, Japan officially eases arms export rules to allow weapons sales. And on the same day, the Japanese Prime Minister sends a ritual offering to the notorious Yasukuni Shrine, which honors 14 convicted Class A war criminals from World War II. So let's unpack these moves one by one. Ben, and I'd like to start with you. April the 17th, for all the Chinese people, it's a very notorious day, let's say, or humiliating date, because on that date in 1895, a humiliating unequal treaty was signed between the Qing government and the Japanese government, basically carving out Taiwan to Japan in a treaty called Shimonoseki. So on that day, Japan decided to send its self-defense force vessel into the Taiwan Strait and sailing really in a deliberate fashion. What is Japan trying to do here, Ben?
Well, it's extreme provocation, and this is unfortunately not surprising when we see that Takaichi's government in Japan has been very aggressive. Let's not forget that just a few months ago, Takaichi said that if there were some kind of conflict in the Taiwan Strait, that Japan would militarily intervene. And then just a few weeks later, she sent this ship, an extremely provocative act. I think it's also important to keep in mind this came just a few days after a historic meeting by the KMT leader, the new, relatively younger KMT leader, Zheng Liwen, who visited the Chinese mainland. And it was very friendly. She visited the mausoleum of Sun Yat-sen, of Sun Zhongshan. It was a sign of, brotherly camaraderie across the Taiwan Strait. And then here comes Japan, which has a history of colonizing many parts of China, including Taiwan, trying to disrupt this diplomacy and this peace breakthrough that was brokered just a few days before. So I see this as part of a larger trend toward Japanese militarism, and how Japan and also the United States are acting as forces of destabilization in the Asia-Pacific region, and they're very concerned about peace breaking out, unfortunately. It seems like they actually want to encourage more conflict, whereas the mainland and now the new KMT leadership are trying to do the exact opposite. They want peace and stability.
Mr. Yang, how are Chinese viewing this? What exactly is the Japanese Prime Minister trying to tell the world by sending this Japanese vessel into the Taiwan Strait on that date?
To Chinese people, not only for me, but for Chinese people, the data was very humiliating for whole Chinese. And for Japan, I think that means their aggressive mindset and aggressive actions that caused for bloody wars following that date. So both in Taiwan Island and following that, and then aggression into mainland. So the date is the starting point of Japan aggressing China and caused bloody wars and history for Chinese people and for Asian people. So that day, the Japanese government sent military warships to Taiwan Strait is very aggressive. And also, this is the first time they are testing water to the very sensitive areas. So that alarms all Chinese people that Japan has been on the road for the re-militarization with the accelerated style.
Anna, let me turn to you. What is not told to the world when Japan decided to take this move, and why now?
Well, I mean, Ben has indicated very clearly that there are reasons there, but there are a number of other aspects to this. There was on April 7th, there was also a document signed that was foundational to the Meiji Restoration. This is the period when Japan reunited because of the humiliation of the United States. So there are other things that are going on here, but quite clearly, this is a provocation aimed at China. And the timing, although some of these deals took some time to put together, is really, to me, a lot to do with Donald Trump, who is supposedly going to be in China. There's some real distrust with Japan in the United States. They want to keep the pot boiling. And quite frankly, it seems that Takaishi is all in, not on improving the economy of her country, which is now under severe threat because of the blockade of the Straits of Hormuz. They receive over 90, I think it's over 95% of their energy from outside, and that is a vital corridor. But instead of trying to figure this out and work collectively, she has thrown her hat in the ring and said, look, we're going to provoke China. And as I said, this is, I think, aimed at Donald Trump.
Let me put this into perspective. Imagine this would be a former colonizer sailing its warships to one of its former colonies, trying to send a message, and sailing through in a very provocative and deliberate manner. And this is appalling. I think this is just a totally unacceptable provocation. And yet Japan, the Japanese government, has decided to take this move. What, Mr. Yang, do you think is trying to tell to China? That be careful, I have a role to play here, or this is my business? What do you think they're trying to say to China?
I don't think Japan thought it was a Japanese business. I believe they indeed think that their action sent a signal to China that by saying Taiwan is the lifeline for Japan, just as their prime minister made a very aggressive provocative remarks earlier date. And after the aggressive remarks, they send the warships with also aggressive action. So combined the remarks and the actions that reflects that on one hand, Japan reaffirmed that Taiwan is their lifeline. Just like nearly 100 years ago, they regarded Mongolia and Manchuria were their lifelines. So the mindset of a lifeline is the base for their aggressive mindset. 100 years has been passed. Their mindset remain unchanged. So with such a dangerous mindset, the logic of a lifeline will input Japan towards a very dangerous direction by militarization. So the action means acceleration of the re-militarization and also send a signal that Japan will probably repeat what they did in the past for the future.
When you say repeat what they did in the past, do you mean militarist expansion, invasion? What exactly are you talking about, Mr. Yang?
I have seen a very similar history before they started their invasion war in Asia. They had military build-ups, they had militarization, and then they invaded their neighboring countries. And nowadays, they started again by military build-ups by three dimensions. One dimension is they revised step by step in the legal systems that allows Japanese, the so-called self-defense forces, can project their forces beyond their boundary that bind by their pacifist constitution. But they had done that. And the second dimension is they has been increasing their military budget faster than more faster than their economic growth rate. And they have been the so-called third largest military expenditure state in the world. Although they stated, oh, we have a pacifist constitution. And by the third dimension, they have resumed their weapon or defense industry production, not only for themselves, but also for the export. That will make a cycling, say, export by making money, and the money will support the re-militarization. So by that cycle, Japan self-defense forces will have a legal basis, will have enough money, will have their enough capability to do what they want. And what they want to do is a key question. It's saying those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And as I mentioned, they remain keep their mindset, the so-called lifelines. Lifeline is not in their side, in their country. They always regard their lifeline beyond their boundary. With this unchanged mindset, that's the base for the aggression. That's the base for their invasion. With the mindset and with their increasing military capabilities supported by their legal revised system, supported by their large military budget, I'm really worried that they will make another dangerous trend in the Asia that alarm China. We have to do something to prevent Japan from repeat their invasion history.
So what is she trying to say to the Chinese by taking this move? Is she saying that the Taiwan Strait is international water where Japan has its stake as well? Ben, what do you think is the specific message she's trying to send to the Chinese government?
Well, that Japan is serious about becoming another military force again. Takaichi is continuing a trend that didn't begin with her. She's, of course, accelerating it. But, of course, Abe Shinzo also was trying to remilitarize Japan. There is a push to rewrite the constitution to allow Japan to remilitarize. And you also mentioned, some of these other extremely aggressive acts, like honoring these Class A war criminals who during, the war of Japanese aggression in the West known as World War II, which started even earlier for the people of China, when Japan invaded multiple parts of China, tried to colonize multiple parts of China, including Taiwan, which shows how aggressive these Japanese provocations are, because this is a country that has a history of colonizing this part of China. And now they're honoring these war criminals who committed some of the worst crimes. The Class A war criminals were hanged. 7 of them were hanged for the crimes that they committed. And yet now this current administration, following Abe's footsteps, has been honoring the war criminals who were hanged for the crimes against humanity they committed against the Chinese people. The only conclusion you can get from this is that Japan is trying to rewrite that imperialist history in order to remilitarize, and it wants to threaten China. It wants to send a message to China that Japan should be a new dominant power in the Asia-Pacific region.
There are the other developments as well, and I'm going to, come to the argument of some people who may say that, look, Japan has a right to rearm itself. We'll come to that in just a moment, but let's take a look at some of the other moves that I mentioned. For instance, Japan and Australia signing a deal to supply Canberra with warships that's worth $7 billion US. I really wonder how significant is that as a military deal, because this is also the biggest military sale since 2014. Aina.
Well, I mean, obviously, this is just more provocation. Japan is trying to breathe more life into its arms export business. This was in conjunction with saying that it's going to loosen its ability to send arms to other countries. Now, in terms of its rights to do this, that's nonsense. They signed under duress a pacifist constitution, which said that they are not allowed to do any of these things, that they're only allowed to intervene in terms of pure self-defense. When you start projecting that I have to attack somebody for my own defense, it's nonsense. This is exactly what the United States always says. They're intervening because there could be some danger, as we have seen, as we are seeing right now with Iran. But, going back to the Yakushuni Shrine, remember, these criminals were not buried there. They were moved there deliberately as a subterfuge. And it was so that they could go to this and say, oh, we're just honoring the war dead. It's nonsense. This is once again, what Ben referred to as rewriting history. But it's not an attempt just now. If you go to Japanese schools, school children are taught that the rape of Nanjing, where 300,000 people were butchered in the space of 6 weeks, and this included soldiers who were unarmed and civilians. They were told that this was just something that Japan was trying to help because there was some bad things going on there. This is the kind of stuff that they're doing. But going ahead, this idea that Japan is going to be the dominant power in Asia, I disagree with. They have no hope of doing that. You start looking at their demographics, their ability to produce. But they are trying to do this kind of normalization thing, or what they call normalization. They want to be a factor, and they're concerned, and this is why I was mentioning Donald Trump, about the US. Is it a reliable entity? Europe certainly wouldn't think so at this point. So there are a lot of different currents going on, but certainly the river is moving in one direction in terms of Japan. I just wonder if she's trying to provoke an incident so she can try to change the constitution, get the upper house, which she does not have right now, a majority, so that she can change the constitution, which rightly pointed out is what the goal here is.
Well, clearly, the constitutional amendment, which is to get rid of the peace provision of that pacifist constitution, is being openly fast-tracked, whereas it was in the past a more of untouchable thing politically. But on the other hand, it seems that they are kind of slicing the sausage, one step at a time, and they have been doing this for decades on end. The very latest news, besides the provision of warships to Australia, is also Japan's officially easing arms export rules to allow weapons sales. Ben, help the viewers understand exactly what has Japan managed to accomplish, and what does it mean in terms of Japan's militarist ambitions?
Well, this is a massive step toward remilitarization. And, continuing what Einar said, I think if we look at what's happening in the Trump administration right now in the US, I think it's important to link that to this remilitarization drive in Japan, and especially with arms sales, because, of course, the US and Japan militarily are very closely allied, and especially the arms industry. And if you look at what's happening in Europe and you look at what's happening in Japan, it presents two different responses to the increasing unilateralism and aggression of the Trump administration. Trump is threatening and bullying many longtime US allies. In Europe, the response of many governments has been to seek a more independent foreign policy and to improve relations with China, not to push for more conflict. In Japan, the response has been the opposite. Japan is so dependent on the US, and the US is also promoting this remilitarization and especially the arms sales. Trump constantly says Japan is too dependent on the US, so he's trying to pressure Japan to spend more and also to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in the US. And part of that is in the arms industry. And so what Japan's response has been is really the opposite of Europe's response. While Europe is sending many heads of state to Beijing to improve relations with China, Japan is moving toward a more aggressive policy and remilitarizing to prepare for potential future conflict. So I think it's very useful to compare these two regions. And although Europe, yes, is also unfortunately trying to remilitarize, many countries are doing this, I think Japan's is very different because Europe's is meant in a way that it wants to be a little more independent of the US, whereas Japan continues going with the US down this very dangerous path toward conflict in the Asia-Pacific region.
In terms of militarism, in terms of expansionism, what would it mean for Japan to be able to, freely export arms in the international market? Will it increase its military capability? And, Japanese Prime Minister Takei Sanaichi was trying to justify the sales of these weapons, talking about, she wrote on social media, for instance, saying no country can now safeguard its own peace and security alone, making it necessary to have partners that support each other in areas including defense, equipment. What do you think of his justification, Ben?
Well, again, it's not entirely clear who those partners will be. One of the implications is it could be joint ventures and partnerships between the US and Japan in making this military technology. That's a possibility. Or Japan may also be seeking to sell some of these weapons to other countries in the Asia-Pacific region, like, for instance, the Philippines. We know if you look at the national security strategy published by the White House late 2025, if you listen to the very hawkish speeches that were given by the self-appointed Secretary of War, formerly known as the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, he visited the Asia-Pacific region last year, including the Philippines and Japan. He gave very hawkish speeches aimed at China. He always calls it communist China. And he said, we're going to work with Japan and the Philippines against communist China, as he said. And now we have these remilitarization efforts that have been accelerated under Takaichi, these very provocative acts in the Taiwan Strait, and the announcement of military sales. It seems to me that, again, this is part of a larger Asia-Pacific strategy, what the US calls the Indo-Pacific strategy, trying to bring India in as well. And basically, the US is not only encouraging Japan to remilitarize, but really the region itself. And so I think that the implication from those remarks that you quoted from Takaichi is that Southeast Asia could be some of the potential markets where Japan is trying to increase its soft power and increase its influence as part of this anti-China policy.
One of the things that the Chinese people always ask is that, look, if Japan breaks away from its post-war constitution, that would mean what was agreed upon at the end of the Second World War would be discarded in the dustbin. You can just revise your constitution and throw away what was decided at the end of the war, where millions of lives were lost as a cost, as victims of Japanese militarism. But it seems that a lot of people are not talking about it. They don't care about it, and they're talking about the so-called pacing threat of China. Aina, how do you look at that? I mean, for the Chinese people, it's just not acceptable. You agreed to, you surrendered on these terms, and now you want to change the constitution unilaterally. What about the other countries who together sealed the document, the legal documents that finalized the Second World War? Is the world going to run on such crazy terms?
Unfortunately, yes. And China was not the only one. South Korea is not going to be particularly happy with this as well as the other nations that Japan brutalized. The number of dead in China directly because of military action and because they took the food. And then there was the biological warfare and in various cities where they dropped poison grains and then also globules or something that immediately afterwards there was epidemics. Was 35 million people out of 100 million total during World War II.
Mr. Yang, some people would say, we have that fable where you don't try to save a frozen snake because once it comes back to life, it might bite you one day fatally. Is that the situation at this moment for, Japan being a frozen snake being revitalized by the United States, and also, the regional countries such as the Philippines being a victim of Japanese aggression during Second World War, actually warming up to Japanese military ambitions at this moment?
I don't think Japan in a quiet stage from remilitarization. To the contrast, they have been doing everything they can to accelerate the remilitarization, as I mentioned earlier, by three dimensions. In short, Japan has been doing what they want towards remilitarization in systematic style. That means Japan, although they remain using the name of the self-defense, actually their military forces has been commanded by both defensive and offensive capabilities. For example, they have got a middle range of missiles delivery, far beyond their boundary. They have sent their military, the so-called self-defense forces, to the region beyond their boundary. Especially this time, they sent their warships beyond their boundary through Taiwan Strait, send a political signal and a military signal and a strategic signal to Chinese people that they are coming back. So that's why I said they have alarmed all Chinese people by this action, by their aggressive action.
Finally, Mr. Yang, how do you look at the saying, some people saying, look, Germany is now more or less a normal country, and they're talking about rearming, which is also concerning to a lot of people, actually. What about Japan? Why can't Japan have its right of self-defense?
It's a very meaningful comparison. Yes, in my view, Germany have been indeed on the road to accelerating their military build-ups. But the difference between Germany and Japan is Germany, by both authorities, the government and by the ordinary people, have got right recognition of their history. But Japan, as I mentioned, they insist on their aggression mindset, deny to recognize what they did criminally. And for example, they invaded China, but in their textbook, they tell their children by generations and generations, say they entered China, they entered Asian countries, not invaded. So by the different mindset and different acknowledgement of the history, that will really means that different direction between Germany and Japan, simply because based the same mindset by the older Japanese generation, the nowadays generation of Japan government is trying to repeat what they did during the past.
Well, that's why when a Japanese politician goes to the Yasukuni Shrine, where the mastermind behind the raping of Nanjing is worshipped, guess why the Chinese people will be extremely alarmed and extremely angry. And it's the same thing with people in other parts of Southeast Asia, where Japan invaded once also. Let's not forget these history. We don't have time for more discussion, but the situation is extremely alarming. And many thanks to my guests, Ben Norton, Yang Xiyu, and Ina Tangen, for helping us understand exactly where the current is going. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Central China's Henan province. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook, X, and YouTube using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.